Rows of reporters, legal analysts, and spectators packed the space, all eager to witness the final fall of Margaret Westwood, a woman who had once ruled New York's elite with an iron grip. Now, she sat at the defense table, stripped of her power, her wealth, her control. The silk gowns and diamond-studded jewelry were gone. Instead, she wore a plain navy suit, her hair neatly pulled back, but no amount of poise could hide the exhaustion in her face. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother as she truly was. Small. Defeated. Afraid. But I felt nothing. No sympathy. No regret. Only resolve. This was the day Margaret Westwood would finally answer for what she had done. The guilty plea. All rise. The bailiff's voice cut through the courtroom as the judge took his seat. The rustle of fabric filled the air as everyone stood. Then, silence. The judge's gaze settled on my mother. Defendant Margaret Westwood, how do you plead to the charges of fraud, embezzlement, and document forgery? For a moment, I thought she might fight back, weave one last lie, try to reclaim her power. But Margaret had run out of tricks. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. Guilty. The room erupted into murmurs. The reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicking in rapid succession. Margaret Westwood, the woman who had spent decades stealing, manipulating, and destroying lives, had just admitted to everything. But this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every single person she had hurt. Unveiling the full scope of the crimes. The lead prosecutor stood, adjusting his tie before stepping toward the jury. This case is not simply about a family dispute, he began, his voice steady and precise. It is about a woman who systematically stole millions, not just from her own daughter, but from countless victims who trusted her. He gestured toward the screen at the front of the courtroom. Exhibit A, a timeline of fraudulent financial transactions. Millions siphoned into offshore accounts. Fake investments. Real estate deals built on forged signatures. Exhibit B, testimonies from victims. A young single mother, her voice shaking as she took the stand. She told me she was helping me, she whispered. I was struggling to pay my rent. She said she could get me a loan under a special, family assistance program, but the interest rates were impossible. I lost everything. I had to declare bankruptcy. And when I begged her for help, she just laughed. Another witness, a young entrepreneur. At first, I looked up to her, he admitted. I thought she was a mentor. But before I knew it, she had maneuvered her way into owning most of my company. She made sure the contracts were airtight, I had no way out. Testimony after testimony. One victim after another. The weight of her crimes grew heavier with every word. I turned to look at Margaret, wondering if any of it affected her. She sat stone-faced, unmoving. But her hands were clenched into fists. The betrayal of Vanessa. Then came the final blow. Your Honor, we have one last piece of evidence to submit into record. The prosecutor's voice was calm, deliberate. A series of emails appeared on the courtroom screen. Margaret had not just stolen from me, she had been training Vanessa to follow in her footsteps. The emails detailed fraud strategies, manipulation tactics, instructions on how to exploit legal loopholes. My sister, her golden child, had been groomed to inherit the empire of deception. Vanessa, sitting on the other side of the room, turned pale. Her hands shook as she read the words on the screen. I felt something tighten in my chest, not anger, but something worse. Disappointment. Vanessa, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. She turned to me, her eyes wide, frantic. I didn't know, she whispered. I swear, I didn't know it was this bad. Didn't you? I asked. Her lips parted, but no words came. For the first time in her life, Vanessa had no defense. And then, slowly, she stood. A sister's choice. The courtroom fell silent. Everyone turned to look at Vanessa as she stepped forward. Her voice, when she finally spoke, wavered, but it did not break. "I would like to testify," she said. A ripple of surprise moved through the gallery. Margaret's head snapped toward Vanessa. "Vanessa," she hissed. "Sit down." But for the first time in her life, Vanessa didn't obey. She turned toward the judge, chin trembling but resolute. "I spent my whole life believing my mother could do no wrong," Vanessa said, her voice thick with emotion. "I ignored the red flags. I told myself Olivia was just bitter, that she was exaggerating. But I see the truth now." Her gaze landed on Margaret. "You never loved us," she said. "You only loved control." Margaret flinched. For the first time in her life, she looked truly shaken. The verdict. The judge's gavel struck against the wood, the sound slicing through the silence of the courtroom. Considering the severity of these crimes, the widespread impact on victims, and the defendant's deliberate manipulation of financial systems, this court sentences Margaret Westwood to 15 years in federal prison. Furthermore, all assets obtained through fraudulent means will be seized and allocated to a victim relief fund. A hush fell over the room. Then, a quiet applause. Victims wiped away tears. Some hugged each other. The empire of Margaret Westwood had officially crumbled. She barely reacted. She simply sat there, silent, unmoving. As they moved to take her away, she turned to me one last time. Her lips parted. Maybe to beg for forgiveness. Maybe to blame me. I didn't wait to hear what she had to say. I stood, turned my back on her, and walked out of the courtroom. For the first time in my life, I was free. The world had moved on from Margaret Westwood. Her name, once synonymous with wealth, power, and influence, had become nothing more than a cautionary tale, a warning of how high one can rise and how fast they can fall. Her real estate empire had crumbled, her business partners abandoned her, and her once loyal allies erased any trace of their connection to her. She was no longer feared. No longer admired. She was simply gone. And yet, the damage she left behind remained. But I wasn't just going to move on. I was going to make sure no one else suffered the way I had. The weeks following the trial were a blur of interviews, meetings, and endless calls. People reached out from everywhere, survivors of financial abuse, people trapped in toxic family structures, those who had been silenced, manipulated, drained. I hadn't realized how many of us there were. I sat in my apartment one night, surrounded by letters, emails, messages from people who saw themselves in my story. "You should go public with this," Michael said, leaning against the kitchen counter. I looked up, exhausted. I already did. The trial was public. "That was about Margaret," he said, his voice steady. "This is about everyone else who's still trapped." And just like that, I knew what I had to do. 2 months later, I stood on a stage at Columbia University, delivering my first public speech. Cameras were rolling. The auditorium was packed. I took a slow breath. No more silence. No more fear. "Financial abuse is the most invisible form of control," I began. "It disguises itself as love, as obligation, as duty. And for years, I believed I had no choice but to endure it." The audience was silent, listening. But silence enables abusers. And today, we are breaking that silence. The applause was deafening. That night, we officially launched the Financial Abuse Prevention Initiative, a nonprofit dedicated to helping victims escape economic entrapment, providing free legal aid for those being financially manipulated, creating awareness programs so that no one else would fall into the same traps. It wasn't just an organization. It was a movement. For weeks, I debated whether I should reach out to Vanessa. She had chosen to testify against our mother. She had broken free. But did that erase everything else? One evening, my phone buzzed with an email. Subject: I think I finally understand. I hesitated before opening it. I left New York. I'm working at a community health clinic in Maine. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm doing something that matters. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I'm trying to be better. You were right. Mom never loved us, she only loved control. I hope one day, we can be sisters again. I stared at the screen for a long time. Would I ever fully forgive her? I wasn't sure. But I knew this: we were no longer trapped in our mother's story. We were finally writing our own. 1 year after the trial, Michael walked into our apartment, a newspaper in his hand. It's official, he said, setting it down in front of me. Congress passes the Financial Abuse Prevention Act. I exhaled sharply, my chest tightening. The law, our law, was real. It would ensure that no one else could be legally trapped the way I had been. Your testimony was the turning point, Michael murmured. I looked out the window, watching as the New York skyline glowed under the evening sun. For so many years, it had been a prison, a city that belonged to my mother. But now, it was mine. And for the first time, I was free. 2 years had passed since the trial, but its echoes still rippled through my life. The name Margaret Westwood, once whispered with admiration in New York's elite circles, had faded into obscurity. Once, she had been feared, revered. Now, she was a cautionary tale, a lesson in how power built on deception always collapses. Her real estate empire had vanished. The Westwood name had been erased from corporate directories, charity boards, and social circles. Her former allies had abandoned her, her investors had turned against her, and her once loyal employees had testified in court to save themselves. And Margaret? She now lived in a small, government-assigned apartment in suburban Boston. Gone were the penthouses, the lavish vacations, the custom designer wardrobes. She had nothing left. She was placed in a rehabilitation program for white-collar criminals, mandatory financial ethics courses, community service, group counseling. And yet, she still wrote to me. The first letter arrived 3 months after her sentencing. I won't ask for forgiveness. But I want you to know. I'm proud of what you've built. I never wrote back. Not yet. A movement, not just a mission. The Financial Abuse Prevention Initiative had grown beyond my wildest expectations. We now had offices in all 50 states, working alongside lawmakers, financial institutions, and legal experts to create early detection programs for financial abuse. Provide free legal aid for victims trying to escape economic entrapment. Educate banks on recognizing red flags in controlled accounts. At every event, I met people who had once felt as powerless as I had. Hearing your story gave me the courage to leave, a woman told me at a conference in Chicago. For the first time in years, I have control over my own life. I smiled, because I finally understood something I never had before. This wasn't just about bringing down Margaret Westwood. It was about giving people the power to reclaim their own stories. The letter I wasn't ready to write. One evening, Michael found me sitting at my desk, staring at an unopened envelope. Another letter from her, he asked softly. I nodded. Are you going to read it? I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the seal. After a long moment, I shook my head. Not yet. Michael didn't push. He just placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. Whenever you're ready. I wasn't sure if that day would ever come. But I knew this: for the first time, I had a choice. A legacy of freedom. 1 year later, I stood before the United States Congress, testifying in support of the Financial Abuse Prevention Act. The cameras flashed. The microphones amplified every word. Financial abuse is the most invisible form of control, I told the room of policymakers. It disguises itself as love, as obligation, as family duty. It chains victims without them even realizing they're trapped. I took a steady breath. For years, I lived in silence, believing there was no way out. Today, I stand here because someone gave me a voice. It's time we do the same for others. By the time I stepped off the stand, I knew something had changed. The bill passed 3 months later. Our law was real. It ensured that no one else could be legally trapped the way I had been. That night, as I stood in my office overlooking the city, Michael walked in, holding a framed newspaper. Congress passes the Financial Abuse Prevention Act. I ran my fingers over the headline, exhaling sharply. Your testimony was the turning point, Michael murmured. I looked out at the New York skyline, once my prison, now my home. For so long, I had been bound to a name I despised, shackled by a woman who had tried to mold me into something I wasn't. But now, I was free. And I had built a legacy of my own. Olivia Westwood's story is more than a tale of revenge, it's a powerful lesson on self-worth, resilience, and justice. 1. Take control of your own life. For years, Olivia let her mother dictate her path, but in the end, she took back her power. No one, not even family, has the right to control your future. 2. Truth will always prevail. Margaret built an empire on lies, but deception never lasts forever. No matter how strong illusions seem, truth always finds a way to surface. 3. Justice is worth fighting for. Not everyone gets a chance to seek justice, but when you do, stand up for yourself and for others who can't. 4. Let go and move forward. Olivia chose growth over revenge, proving that true strength lies in breaking free from the past, not being consumed by it. Final thought. Be strong. Speak up. Take back your life. You deserve to live freely, on your own terms. Hello, I'm Alex, and I bring you the story of Olivia Westwood. This is not just a story about wealth, power, or betrayal, it's about resilience, justice, and reclaiming one's life. Olivia grew up believing she was part of a loving, prestigious family, only to realize she was nothing more than an investment to her mother, Margaret Westwood. But when the truth was revealed, Olivia did what no one expected, she fought back. Tonight, I invite you to witness her journey, from oppression to empowerment, from silence to a voice that changed lives. Because at its core, this story carries a powerful message: no one has the right to control your future, not even family. So sit back, stay with me, and let's dive into Olivia's incredible fight for freedom. I was 15 when I realized I was nothing more than an investment. It was late, past midnight, when I logged into my bank account, expecting to see my $50,000 college scholarship deposit. Instead, the balance read $0. My stomach twisted as I refreshed the page, willing it to be some kind of banking error. But the reality was unshakable. The money was gone. Panicked, I ran down the grand staircase of the Westwood estate, my bare feet cold against the marble floors. My mother's office door was ajar, and inside, I saw her, Margaret Westwood, Queen of New York real estate, sitting at her mahogany desk, sipping a glass of red wine. She didn't even look up when I stormed in. "Where's my money?" My voice trembled, but I refused to let her see my fear. Margaret finally glanced at me, her expression unbothered, almost amused. "Lower your voice, Olivia. You're being dramatic." I slammed my bank statement onto her desk. "This is my scholarship. My name is on it. You stole it." She exhaled slowly, setting her wine down before folding her hands neatly. "It wasn't stolen. It was reallocated. You should be grateful, really. Your money went to something far more important. More important than my education." My voice cracked. Margaret gave me a pointed look, as if she were explaining something obvious to a slow child. "You think education is free? Do you have any idea how much it costs to maintain our status? The trips, the private tutors, the events, everything I've given you has a price. I felt my whole world tilt. Everything I had worked for, every sleepless night, every sacrificed weekend, had been for nothing. You always talk about family loyalty, I whispered, gripping the edge of her desk, but you never take from Vanessa. Her lips twitched, the closest thing to a smile. Vanessa is different. She understands her role in this family. You, on the other hand, have always been difficult. That was the moment I knew I would never be enough. Not for her. Not for this family. I was not her daughter. I was her collateral. A lifetime of chains. The years that followed were a carefully controlled nightmare. Margaret never outright disowned me, but she never let me forget that I owed her everything. Every paycheck I earned was funneled into family expenses. Every career move I made was orchestrated to benefit her reputation. Every personal success was dismissed as expected, while Vanessa's achievements were celebrated, broadcasted, worshipped. Even now, standing in the Westwood Estate Grand Ballroom on the night of my wedding, nothing had changed. The scent of fresh roses and expensive champagne lingered in the air as the city's elite murmured around me, their laughter and clinking glasses blending into white noise. The ballroom was a vision of perfection, crystal chandeliers, gold-accented walls, a six-tiered wedding cake. And yet, this wasn't my wedding. It was Margaret's masterpiece. "Everything is perfect, darling," she said, adjusting an invisible wrinkle on my gown. Her eyes gleamed with satisfaction as she took in the guest list of politicians, business moguls, and high society elites. This is what a Westwood wedding should be: grandeur, prestige, perfection. Perfection. The word rang hollow. Margaret had spent decades crafting the perfect family image. The ruthless matriarch. The golden daughter. The obedient investment. I had played my role for 28 years. But tonight, I would burn the whole script to the ground. The red folder. I felt the weight of the red folder tucked beneath the podium where the evening speeches would be given. Inside it lay 20 years of secrets. Fraudulent transactions. Forged signatures. Stolen investments, including my inheritance, used to fund Margaret's latest real estate project. Michael, my fiancé, stood across the room, speaking quietly with his colleagues from the law firm. They weren't just here to celebrate. They were here to witness the fall of Margaret Westwood. I tightened my grip around my champagne flute, my pulse steady. In just a few hours, the entire world would know. Margaret swept through the room like royalty, Vanessa trailing obediently beside her. "Look at our brilliant doctor," she cooed to the guests, gesturing toward Vanessa. "She's being promoted to department head at New York Presbyterian next month." A polite round of applause followed. Across the room, I caught Michael's mother watching me. She had been the only parental figure who ever truly saw me. I had once broken down in her arms, confessing everything. "You must reclaim your life, Olivia," she had whispered, holding me tight. "Don't let her control you forever." Tonight, I was finally taking that advice. The beginning of the end. Margaret, oblivious, was already positioning herself for her grand toast. She had no idea what was coming. Across the ballroom, Michael met my gaze. A silent nod. Everything was in place. The video was uploaded. The financial records were ready. Every financial reporter in the city had been tipped off. Margaret Westwood thought she had built the perfect empire. Tonight, I would burn it to the ground. The Westwood Estate Grand Ballroom shimmered under the glow of crystal chandeliers. The scent of fresh-cut roses and champagne filled the air, mingling with the hum of conversation from New York's most powerful figures, CEOs, politicians, socialites, all gathered for what they believed was an event of prestige. Margaret Westwood, my mother, floated through the room in her ivory silk gown, exuding the effortless elegance she had spent decades perfecting. She greeted guests with a gracious smile, her voice warm, her movements graceful. She played the role of the beloved matriarch to perfection. "This is magnificent, Margaret," a senator's wife gushed, taking in the towering six-tier wedding cake, the cascading floral arrangements, the champagne tower shimmering under the candlelight. Margaret accepted the compliment with a modest laugh, touching her pearls. It had to be perfect. A Westwood wedding is more than just a celebration, it's a legacy. A legacy. Tonight, she would lose it all. "Everything is perfect, darling," Margaret purred as she smoothed the stray hair from my face. "Exactly as it should be." I held still, forcing a neutral expression. She had no idea that her carefully curated world was about to implode. Across the room, my fiancé, Michael Donovan, stood with his law firm colleagues, their presence deliberate. They weren't just here to celebrate. They were here to witness the end of Margaret Westwood. For 6 months, Michael and I had built an airtight case. Every forged signature, every embezzled fund, every scholarship stolen under my name had been traced, documented, and prepared for what was coming. The red folder sat beneath the podium, hidden in plain sight, carrying the receipts of 20 years of deception. And in just a few hours, it would be public. Margaret moved through the ballroom like a queen on her coronation night, Vanessa trailing closely behind her, the favorite daughter, the golden child. "Look at our brilliant doctor," Margaret gushed, looping an arm around Vanessa's shoulders. "She's being promoted to department head at New York Presbyterian next month." The guests applauded politely, murmurs of admiration rippling through the crowd. I watched as Michael's mother, Caroline, frowned from across the room. She had once been the only adult who had ever comforted me, the only one who had seen my pain for what it was. "You must reclaim your life, Olivia," she had whispered to me once, holding me close as I cried. "You have the power to end this cycle." Tonight, I would. The suspicion creeps in. Margaret lifted a champagne flute, her eyes sweeping the ballroom, basking in the admiration of her audience. But something shifted when her gaze landed on me. I saw it, a flicker of uncertainty. A hesitation. She knew something was off. She moved toward me, her smile still intact, but her voice dipped just slightly. "You've been quiet tonight, Olivia," she said, eyes sharp, searching. I lifted my own champagne flute, swirling the golden liquid lazily. "Just taking it all in." Her gaze lingered, then darted toward Michael, his law partners, the strategically placed media figures mingling among the guests. Her fingers tightened around her glass. She wasn't sure what she was sensing, but Margaret Westwood did not like feeling out of control. "You're not planning anything foolish, are you?" she asked lightly, but there was a warning beneath her words. I met her gaze, steady, unwavering. "Why would I? This is your night, after all." She studied me for a moment longer before exhaling, flashing her signature poised smile. "Of course. Let's keep it that way." She turned away, but I saw the tension in her shoulders. She was starting to sense the cracks. The pieces fall into place. As the night unfolded, the pieces moved exactly where they needed to be. The video evidence was uploaded and primed for release. The financial documents were encrypted and prepared for live broadcast. The reporters, planted among the guests, were standing by. Everything was in place. And yet, a part of me waited for some last-minute act of sabotage from Margaret, some desperate attempt to regain control. She had spent decades mastering the art of deception, after all. But she had spent too many years underestimating me. As I slipped away from the crowd to do a final check, my phone vibrated in my palm. "Margaret." I hesitated, then answered. "Me." Silence. Then. "I know you're up to something." I inhaled slowly. "Do you?" Margaret's voice was calm, controlled, but there was an edge to it now. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, Olivia, but don't make a mistake you'll regret. Family always comes first." I almost laughed. "Family. That's where you're wrong, Mother. I stepped out onto the ballroom balcony, staring at the skyline of New York, the city that had once been my prison. Tonight, you're finally going to learn what it's like to lose. A beat of silence. Then, a cold laugh. We'll see about that, darling. The line went dead. I exhaled, gripping the railing, the night air sharp against my skin. She knew. She didn't know everything. But she knew enough. But it didn't matter anymore. Because the train was already in motion. And there was no stopping it now. Underscore 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 underscore. I returned to the ballroom just as Margaret stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand, ready to begin her grand toast. This was it. The final performance of Margaret Westwood, Queen of New York. I slipped my hand into my gown's hidden pocket, my fingers closing around the small remote control. With one press of a button, 20 years of secrets would come crashing down. I took a slow breath, my heart steady. Enjoy the moment, Mother. Because in just a few minutes, the world would finally see the truth. The ballroom pulsed with an electric tension, a slow-building anticipation just beneath the surface. Margaret Westwood stood center stage, her ivory silk gown flowing around her like she was royalty. Her champagne glass sparkled under the chandelier's golden light, her expression poised, confident, untouchable. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The final act of her grand illusion. Distinguished guests, she announced, her voice smooth and commanding, the tone of a woman who had never known fear. Tonight, we gather not just to celebrate my daughter's wedding, but to mark the continuation of the Westwood legacy. As many of you know, we are embarking on one of our most ambitious projects yet, a luxury high-rise that will redefine the skyline of New York City. A wave of murmured approval rippled through the crowd. Investors exchanged pleased glances. Politicians nodded subtly. Margaret had played her audience perfectly. But she had no idea that in mere moments, she would lose everything. Across the ballroom, Michael met my gaze. A single, silent nod. The countdown had begun. The trap is sprung. I stepped forward, lifting my own champagne flute. I have a special announcement too. The words sliced through the air, sharp, deliberate. Margaret's smile froze. Her grip on her glass tightened just slightly, her nails pressing against the delicate crystal. "Olivia, darling," she said smoothly, though I could hear the hint of unease creeping into her voice. "Now's not the time for surprises, sweetheart." "Oh, but this one's important," I replied, stepping closer, my voice carrying through the room. "It's about family. About loyalty. About the things we do for those we love." I saw the exact moment realization dawned in her eyes. Margaret Westwood had spent decades controlling every aspect of my life. But she had never expected me to fight back. I slid my hand into my gown's hidden pocket and pressed the remote control. The massive LED screen behind the stage flickered to life. And then, the truth unraveled. 20 years of secrets, exposed. The first image appeared. A bank statement. The Westwood Family Trust Fund. $5 million withdrawn overnight. My name signed at the bottom. Forged. The second image. Another document. More missing funds. The third. A list of fraudulent financial transactions. Millions siphoned into offshore accounts. Stolen investments. Scholarships meant for struggling students, taken under my name. A murmur spread through the ballroom. Guests leaned forward, brows furrowing. The fourth image. A video recording. Security footage from a bank. A blurry image of Margaret forging my signature on a financial transfer. Silence. Then, chaos. Gasps. Whispers. A few sharp inhales of disbelief. Reporters, who had been invited as wedding guests, immediately pulled out their phones. Across the room, the governor turned away, his jaw clenched. Investors exchanged frantic looks. The illusion of Margaret Westwood was crumbling. And in the center of it all, Margaret stood frozen. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in her eyes. "Olivia," Margaret hissed, stepping toward me, her voice low, dangerous. Desperate. "Turn that off. Right now." I didn't move. Instead, I lifted my microphone, my voice clear, unwavering. For years, my mother built her empire on deception. Margaret's composure cracked. "She has stolen millions, not just from me, but from others. From students. From young entrepreneurs. From investors who trusted her." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. My sister, Vanessa, stood motionless, her face pale. "Did you really not know, Vanessa?" I asked, my voice softer now, filled with something close to resignation. She swallowed hard but said nothing. Margaret, still trying to salvage what little power she had left, forced a hollow laugh. "This is absurd," she declared, voice brittle, fraying at the edges. "Olivia has always been." The next slide cut her off. A list of victims. Names. Faces. Testimonies of people she had financially destroyed. A single, deafening silence fell over the ballroom. Margaret turned to run. Before she could take another step, the ballroom doors burst open. A team of FBI agents entered. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. A female agent strode forward, her badge flashing under the chandelier's light. "Margaret Westwood," she called, voice crisp, authoritative. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and forgery." Margaret staggered back, her face draining of color. The security guards moved forward. Someone in the crowd gasped as Margaret's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor. Her empire, her illusions, had finally collapsed. The whispers turned into full-blown conversations, reporters firing off text messages, snapping photos. I stood still, watching, as Margaret Westwood, once untouchable, was placed in handcuffs. As she was led away, she turned back toward me, her face pale, her voice desperate. "Olivia, please. You can't do this to your own mother." For a brief moment, I felt nothing. No guilt. No remorse. No hesitation. I met her gaze, steady, unflinching. "You did this to yourself." And then, she was gone. The moment Margaret disappeared through the ballroom doors, the entire room seemed to exhale. The whispers turned into full-blown conversations. The cameras flashed. Vanessa slowly turned toward me, her eyes hollow. "I didn't know," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't you?" I asked. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Across the room, Michael reached for my hand, grounding me. It was over. Margaret Westwood had built her empire on lies, stolen wealth, and manipulation. And tonight, in front of New York's most powerful people, I had torn it all down. I lifted my champagne glass, staring at the golden liquid that once symbolized everything Margaret had valued. Then, slowly, deliberately, I poured it onto the floor. Letting the illusion die. And with it, the last hold my mother ever had on me. The courtroom was suffocatingly silent.